Right, we're looking now at our big map of Indochina. I'm going to throw a big what if at you now, Bill. Let's say the Tet Offensive never happened. For whatever reason, the Viet Cong decide it's not the time. Does that mean that Westmoreland then gets his extra 206,000 troops and the US are able to decisively win the Vietnam War?
Wow. Okay. So probably not. He's going to get those troops because he's already made the case that he's winning. So what he would want would be what's already in the pipeline, and actually a lot of that 206 are troops that are already in the pipeline, and it would take a year and a half to get that number of troops over to Vietnam and ready to go and into the chain. So as far as that goes, yeah, I don't think that would have happened. Now, from the North Vietnamese perspective, to bring that in. That's exactly what Giap would have wanted, for Tet not to happen, to continue wearing down the ARVN and the Americans. Slowly use guerrilla tactics, use the NVA as appropriate. Don't waste the NVA, right? Because that's your big conventional force you're trying to build up, and get yourself to a point of negotiation. So I think the what if there would be that everyone would run out of gas, that eventually we're all going to run out of gas, and that's going to get us to the negotiating table. And it might take 4 or 5 years more of fighting to do that, but you're going to get a better settlement. And I think that from the North Vietnamese perspective, or Giap's perspective, that would have been ideal. If you're the South Vietnamese government, if you're President Tu and Prime Minister Ky, you're like, I don't know about that. It'd be nice to have those 200,000 in. Let's get this thing wrapped up, because I'm not sure how much longer we can do this.
And Chris, let's say that the Tet Offensive succeeds. Let's say, and I think probably the only way it could have succeeded is if you then provoke the kind of popular uprising in the South that the Viet Cong were hoping for. Presumably, what ends up happening, which is an American withdrawal eventually, just happens sooner.
Yeah, you get unification. It's as simple as that, which happened eventually. What I think is really interesting is that had Tet not happened, you'd had a negotiated settlement. I suspect you'd have ended up in the same situation today as you have with Korea. North and South Vietnam would still be divided at the demilitarized zone, and we'd be going, that's very odd. We've got two countries that look exactly the same. And what also would have happened is the basis for American containment of China and Russia would have been legitimized. And so we would have seen more foreign interventions to contain communism along the line, because this had legitimized it. But I think, given the fact that both sides were happy to negotiate, but just arguing about the terms and trying to force an advantage, today, as I said, we would see North and South Vietnam, just as we've seen North and South Korea, because that's the way the trends were going at the time.
Bill, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think to a degree, yeah, because I could see the division, as Chris suggests, but I could also see the South Vietnamese government eventually collapsing. It's very tenuous. There's a lot of conflict within it. It's very corrupt, and of course, a lot of Americans who are there in South Vietnam are also very corrupt. Let's be clear about that. There's a lot of black market stuff going on, drug trade, that sort of thing. But it's just so tenuous, and the people of the countryside,
Yeah.
back to them again, are just like I said a while ago, they're running out of gas. They just can't handle this anymore.
And Bill, the other thing, of course, the but that I would put on the end of what I said is what's going on to the west here as well.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is a really unstable area which can be exploited by the North ad infinitum, really. And we see in subsequent, military offensives by the Americans and the South Vietnamese into Cambodia, into Laos, trying to stabilize this, to try and make it not a place where North Vietnam can play. So I think, on the back of what I was saying, the constant instability of South Vietnam would probably be levered by what's going on in here, not just in North Korea.
Well, that's a really good point. Do you get the incursions, Bill, into Laos and Cambodia?
They would have been much more difficult to carry off, I think. And to add maybe one more thing here, if Chris, if you can point on the map to the DMZ
Yep.
there, and that area, if you know the history of the war from Tet on, the two big North Vietnamese offensives are from the DMZ, through
Yep.
the DMZ into that northern part of I Corps. And you're looking at Highway 1 there, which runs all the way down the coast of South Vietnam, all the way to Saigon. Actually, that's the main transportation artery. And now let's be clear, then it was basically a dirt road, but nevertheless, it's the main dirt road going north-south. But in both of those offensives, what they learned, instead of Tet attacking all over the place and so dispersed, it was very concentrated. And not without risk, but they did experience success. And of course, by the time you get to 75, the same way. So I think there was learning there that we can't do that sort of Tet thing again. We've got to keep our forces concentrated and come down from the DMZ through the northern part of South Vietnam.
I mean, I think the other thing is, let's take it across to America now, James, if I may, is what if Johnson says, well, actually, I'm going to stand again?
Well, he makes that's a really good point, because he makes that speech, that famous address from the Oval Office on, I think it was the 31st of March, 1968, where he said, I forget the wording, I shall not seek, nor shall I accept my party's nomination. If the Tet Offensive doesn't happen, does he run again, Bill?
I don't know. There's a part of me that says yes, he probably would run again, because that would, that if Tet had not happened, that would undermine Eugene McCarthy's campaign. It would, of course, undermine Robert Kennedy's campaign, I think, pretty dramatically.
Does Bobby Kennedy enter the race if Tet doesn't happen?
Yeah, I doubt it. I don't think he does.
In which case he doesn't get assassinated.
Well, yeah. I mean,
well,
that's a big if,
right?
yeah.
Yeah, you just push some dominoes there, man. I mean, all sorts of things fall there. So, but I think, one of the key things here with Johnson is he had talked about not running back in the fall of '67 with Lady Bird, his wife, and some close confidants. And his health's not great. He's got a lot of heart trouble. He's already had one minor heart attack, and Lady Bird was not sure he would survive another term. So there's that aspect of it that plays in here. But in August at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, which oh my heck, we're about to have a Democratic National Convention in Chicago here shortly. Johnson actually flirts with showing up. He's not even there. He's at the ranch, outside of Austin. He's got Marine One helicopter, everything ready to go to fly into Chicago and land there in front of the Hilton and show up and maybe take the nomination to try.
Maybe Joe Biden will do it.
Right. Right. I mean, he's not confident at all that Humphrey, can pull it off. And of course, poor Hubert Humphrey is just stuck.
Well, he's seen as continuity Johnson almost. I mean, there's another one.
Although he breaks with Johnson.
Well, he does in the end, doesn't he?
Yeah. He'll break with Johnson, closer to the election. He'll come out and say, "Look, we got to get the heck out of this thing now." Yeah. Peace is the only way. But to Johnson's credit too, he's continuing the fighting while he's president. He is continuing the fight in Vietnam. I mean, it's kinetic, to use Chris's term. It's very kinetic that year. But he's also pushing negotiations. And as Chris mentioned earlier, Nixon working through some intermediaries. Interesting, one of whom is Claire Chennault's wife, for Americans, the famous Flying Tigers. His wife is working with the South Vietnamese government to try to get them to, hey, look, ease up. Wait for Tricky Dick to get elected. He'll give you a better deal, right? Yeah.
Well, let's unpick that, actually. And there's a lot of US politics what ifs here, but this is fascinating. I love this. Bill, if it is Johnson versus Nixon in November 1968, and of course Nixon, off the back of the Tet Offensive, then actually one of his big flagship policies is to end the draft. Does Nixon still win that election? It was a very close election between Nixon and Humphrey. I mean, it was very, very close. And as much as I hate to say it, I think Nixon wins because of what you just said, James, the draft.
if he ends, that promise to end the draft, because it is so contentious. The draft is just so unfair. It changes after 1968. You get rid of the college deferment and some other things, and it becomes more of a lottery system. And ask anybody of draft age in 1969, 1970, and they can tell you what their lottery number is.
Yeah, Bill Clinton can.
I mean, it's.
I mean, let's just. No, carry on.
He had
Bill.
a number. He just wasn't in the country.
Let's follow up on that and just explore. Let's say hypothetically, Johnson somehow decides he's going to run again, and he does beat Nixon, because as Bill accurately says, Humphrey came pretty close to beating Nixon in November of 1968. Mm-hmm. So let's say Nixon's defeated. I mean, the first thing my mind goes to is therefore Watergate doesn't happen, and the rest of US political history looks very, very different.
Well, most importantly, James, the rapprochement with China doesn't happen.
And that has huge implications for this region.
And so, it gets a seat at the UN as a result. There's a rapprochement. It means that America can concentrate on the Soviet Union as its major opponent in the Cold War, and containment then changes. But I think the key issue that Bill and I are interested in very much is what it does to the US military after Vietnam. I think everybody knows that the Vietnam generation was despised, largely neglected. The veterans of Vietnam were famously, I remember going across America myself, and seeing people who basically were down and out because the country wasn't looking after them. It was as simple as that. And there was this real cultural aversion to people who'd served in Vietnam. And it basically resulted in a total revolution in the way the US Army did its wars in future. And the fruit of that was seen in the first Gulf War in 1990s and 91. Precision-guided munitions, the combination of air power, space power, and ground power. And linking that to what you did at sea as well, these joint operations. But more than anything, it's what I call high impact, low footprint operations. So it has changed by revolution by the time you get to 1990. So a lot of the lessons that came from the Second World War were actually filtered through Korea and also Vietnam, got brought into the modern age through the application of technology and joined up thinking. And we ended up with a very, very professional, high impact military by 1990.
That's a fascinating point. Let's bring you in on that, Bill, just finally. I mean, the long-term consequences for the American psyche, I suppose, but also the way the American military operated post the Tet Offensive.
I think the key thing there is the development of the AllVolunteer Force. In 1973, the draft ends. There's a lot of committee work in Congress, joint committees with the Defense Department, et cetera, trying to figure out how do we get away from the draft? Can we have an all-volunteer force? How will this work? How do we convince people, young people, to enlist in the United States military, especially the Army, which after Vietnam, the Army is basically a shell. I mean, it is just a rotten shell. I don't know how else to describe it. It's really in bad shape. And how do you rebuild? And Bill Murray and stripes aside, right? How do you rebuild and have an all-volunteer force? And it worked through very good recruiting campaigns, very good benefits for people who enlisted and that sort of thing. And I think because of that emphasis on the benefits for enlisting, especially money for college, that re-energized veteran attention. And as Chris was saying, initially Vietnam veterans kind of had a very difficult time. And by the early 1980s, that's starting to turn around. You're starting to get more attention to veterans, et cetera. Remember, Chris, James, this may be a little before your time. Magnum PI was one of the first American television programs. Okay, all right, to depict Vietnam veterans in a very positive way.
Yeah.
Because before, the bad guy was always some Vietnam veteran, PTSD ridden, holed up in a bank because he thinks Charlie's out there trying to get him. And that's how they were depicted on American television. And of course, as you all know, popular culture influences the way
Well,
we
there's
view all
MASH
sorts
as well,
of things,
wasn't
but
there?
particularly military service. Yeah.
The whole issue of MASH from Korea rolled forward into that
Yep.
era as well, didn't it? The cynicism and the
Yes.
basic sort of lack of confidence in America's ability to assert itself abroad. Yeah.